Rachel Holt for Nesson.com. Welcome to our Fantasy Football Podcast. Week 1 of the NFL season just wrapped up. Many surprises, many disappointments. If you watched that Rams 49ers games, we're sorry, that was terrible. We're joined by Ryan Fowler of Fox Sports. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
You got it.
As far as wide receivers go, who can people target in week 2 that would be a good addition for their team?
Tajae Sharp is going to be a guy I echo until his ownership percentage is 70-80%. So Tajae Sharp of the Titans will be a PPR machine. I would pick him up first. I think Will Fuller of the Houston Texans, who had a nice game against the Bears, and it was the Bears defense, is going to be another hot commodity this week at wide receiver. He had a big game, but I wouldn't get drunk on the stats, so to speak, because DeAndre Hopkins had fewer targets than Will Fuller, and that's not going to happen week to week. And that was in addition to Lamar Miller getting those 32 touches. So Will Fuller is another guy that you should probably pay attention to. As far as matchups go, what about Mike Wallace against the Cleveland Browns? Jordan Matthews had a monster game in week 1 against the Browns secondary, and I think Mike Wallace against the Browns secondary could be in for a big game. If he can torch the Buffalo Bills like he did in week 1, I think he'll have a little bit of an easier time in week 2. And again, I compare it to what Jordan Matthews was able to do. To wrap it all up, I thought Monday night Eli Rogers played pretty darn well for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, Antonio Brown still got his. D'Angelo Williams went nuts. But you got to pay attention to the amount of targets Eli Rogers got. He had 7 at the half with Ben Roethlisberger, and that was with Roethlisberger and Eli misconnecting on some routes in that first half. There was some body language there with Big Ben was like, settle down, young man. We'll get this figured out. And he scored in the second half. So plenty of wide receivers to choose from. I don't know about consistency outside of Tajae Sharp. I think there's going to be some ebbs and flows, but there are plenty to pick off the waiver wire.
Hey, what about running backs?
That's a tough nut to crack. But we'll go back after the Browns. How about that? Justin Forsett and Terrence West had a little bit of a timeshare there in week 1 against Buffalo. Now, against the Cleveland Browns, I think Justin Forsett could have a bigger game, a bigger role, but West might vulture some touchdowns there inside the 5 because that's what he was doing in the preseason. And you remember, Justin Forsett played in the preseason, then he was cut, then he was re-signed 72 hours later, and they wanted to rework the money part of his deal there in Baltimore. But he still was involved, and he was involved in the passing game. He was involved in the rushing game. I think it's one of those things where you're going to look to exploit that. I think another name on the waiver wire is Isaiah Crowell, believe it or not, on the Browns side. There aren't many bright spots of the Browns offense, but Crowell played well week 1 against the Eagles, and I think in standard leagues, Chris Ivory has this mystery illness down in Jacksonville. He missed week 1, had to go to the hospital, and we're still kind of in wait-and-see mode. He was also dealing with a calf issue, but that was different and not connected to the reason he went to the hospital. So Chris Ivory was a standard league stud where I think he was going to do some great things for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now he's in limbo, and you look at Crowell against the Ravens, maybe not the best matchup, but LaShawn McCoy ran well against the Ravens in week 1. So Crowell, I say it through my teeth, but again, running backs coming off the waiver wire, really hard to figure out. I mean, Theo Riddick had a big game for the Lions against the Colts in the passing and rushing game, but so did Amir Abdullah. So you have a running back timeshare there that you don't want to ignore. I think Theo Riddick could be one of those guys that rides that fantasy point total roller coaster all year, as he did in 2015. I like Theo Riddick. I think he's a guy that should be on rosters, but to trust him week in and week out as an RB2, I think is out of the question. One other name to consider is that RBBC in Atlanta. You have Devonta Freeman, a top pick in many leagues, but Tevin Coleman also around, and there was a report that the Falcons wanted to take some pressure off of Freeman in 2016, and so far so good for Tevin Coleman as he was heavily involved in the passing game of the Falcons.